Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon. What I thought I would start with is just a little sort of mental break for you, just for a couple minutes. I first saw this happening at a show in the US. John Madison, who is the head of products for Fortinet, got up and he gave a little bit of a historical context. Where are we? What's a little bit of a story of the place we are? So I thought maybe you could use that just to take a mental breather. Now, John was doing this in Orlando, Florida, which really doesn't have a lot of history. It kind of goes back to Walt Disney and stops. Whereas here I've got a lot more to work with. So just very quickly, Den Hague, this strange name that we have, it actually came from Die Hague, first appeared in 1242, so quite a while ago. The meaning of it, or it became known more formally as Des Gravenhage, which is the Count's Wood. So some local noble had managed to secure a bunch of the forest and use it for deer hunting and grouse hunting and that sort of thing. The name still appears on some official documents, but now is known as Den Haag, or we in English butcher it and call it the Hague, which is really a translation of nothing in particular, just the sound. Most interestingly, the people who are from Den Haag are called Hageneers, which is got to be on the list of funnier city names. And the most famous one that I could find was Johannes Vermeer, who was a great Dutch Golden Age painter. He's this guy. Painted himself into a few of his paintings. He's best known for The Mermaid, which you can see in Amsterdam at the Rijksmuseum if you get up there. Also The Astronomer in the Louvre, if you can see it. And The Astronomer is interesting because at the time that he was doing his painting, in the mid-1600s, astronomers were a little bit like maybe high-tech moguls are for us. They're kind of the cool guys peering into the abyss, inventing the future, that sort of stuff. And the coolest of the cool was Sir Isaac Newton. So Sir Isaac Newton was flourishing at exactly the same time as Johannes Vermeer, and he was a professor at Cambridge. But in 1665, he wasn't able to teach at Cambridge because Cambridge was closed due to the plague. It was another outbreak of the bubonic plague and kept the university closed in 1665-66, which gave him a lot of time to sit around and think, work on his theories, and sit under apple trees. And of course, we all know what came after the apple landed on his head. He started to wonder what brought the apple down. Force equals mass times acceleration, which we all learned at some point in our past. So that all happened in 1666, which was the same time that Vermeer painted his most famous painting, which is also here in Den Haag, if you've got a little bit of time to go see it. And now you might be wondering, geez, why does that painting look so familiar to me? I'm not really a student of Dutch Golden Age painting, but this painting was featured on the cover of this book, which was a bestseller and has been staring out at you from bookshelves as you've been running through airport for the last 20 years. So that is a quick history and mental break. But I'm sure as you're running through the airport most recently, you were thinking, I've got to get to Den Haag so I can get my Edge NFV update. So without further ado, we will switch over to that. This is the third time I've done this. Last year, there was a sort of a meme going around the conference. Jean Savi from Orange got up and said, "Oh, it's not going very well. It's not delivering what it was promised. There's this fake virtualization going on." And Axel Klauberg from DT got up and said something along the same lines, and the press was off to the races. They said, "That's it. NFV is done. Nothing good is ever going to happen." So it was, in a sense, true, and in a sense, completely untrue. The reality is a lot of these guys started working with their traditional IP service provider, the aggregated full stack vendors that we talked about earlier. And those people are strongly motivated to disaggregate very partially and very slowly because they're making great money selling full stack solutions. As a result, it doesn't go especially well, and it's only when operators kind of really bite into it and say, yes, we want a disaggregated solution, that they really start to enjoy some of the benefits of moving to this new technology. So these solutions are out there. There are a number of vendors at the hardware layer. Some of them are listed here. There are a number of vendors at the middleware layer, which is where we play. And of course, there's a very large number of VNF vendors. This stuff is available. We have customers on every continent. Many of those are the type who then serve customers who play also multi-regionally. It is a going concern. All right, so if you missed the first 2 years, you're all caught up. What I'd like to do now is just focus on what we see in the industry. So my job is basically just to fly around and talk to operators all over the planet and see what they're doing in the edge UCPE space. So 3 things I'd like to talk about. What's going on in the service provider market, what's going on with enterprises directly, and then just a little bit about technology at the end. So first up, where's the edge? This graphic is adapted from something that Michael Howard was showing here last year. And the clearest way to say what the edge is almost to say what it isn't. So it's not the core. So what you can see over on the far side here is core. And that sort of thing is serviced by middleware players, especially big ones like VMware, Red Hat, Canonical. Those sorts of players are the ones who get the call. It's characterized by racks of compute. It's very data center-ish in its feel and in its vendor selection. Out at the edge, though, on our side, it's really a different type of space. It's taking that cloud technology out and making it viable in the CPE world. And that's a lot of CPE stuff and a lot less cloud stuff than you'd think. So the space that we participate in is in the middle here on the right-hand side is what's referred to as far edge. So this is typically a UCPE offering. So what distinguishes things that are out here is the compute platforms are small, typically 1 compute node. Maybe 4 is kind of the minimum, but up to 32 core is a very typical spread of compute power. You are dominated by WAN networking, so this is something that sits at the end of the long wire. But the biggest animal by far is all of these remote management OEM values. If I'm an operator, I have to plan for rolling out tens of thousands of these things, and I know that if I start rolling trucks out to these sites, my business case goes down the toilet, so it has to be well manageable remotely. So that's the sort of stuff that we see in our space. Down below that area is really the same technology, but run through a different channel. So enterprises are starting to buy UCPE directly. It began life here as a very managed service provider topic, and that's all great. But the truth is enterprises are just as interested, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally up at the top, and this is probably where the most interesting battle is to be had between the 2 different types of cloud vendors. The core cloud guys are kind of riding out on the back of their entrenched positions with VEPC. And yet they're running into these places that are very remote. They have different OEM requirements, et cetera, which really smell and feel a lot more like the UCPE world. So there'll be some interesting shaking out to happen in that part of the market. But that's what I would define as the edge. Okay, so talking about service providers. The theme last year, as we said, was the malaise. And for us, coming into that, it was really interesting because we knew at the time we had several unannounced service provider wins. We knew many others were proceeding towards selection in the very near future, and we knew that the media hype around the end of NFV or discomfort or whatever you want to call it was well overdone and kind of out of sync. It was reasonably accurate looking back. So from mid-2018, if you cast back in time, there were only a few hardy souls who had jumped onto the UCPE story. But now you can see that it's the hockey stick. So why? Right? And I think there's only one explanation, really. It's customer demand. There's a single or a few visionary providers might make selections because they see it's the future or they're technologists or whatever. But the mass market only responds to one thing, and that's money. And there, it's from the end enterprises. I sat down recently with the head of products for one of the major US telcos, and he said in the RFPs that he sees coming into him from enterprises for managed services, that over half of them now ask for UCPE by name. They don't yet mandate it. It's a question, not a must-have, but that's up from about nothing this time a year ago. So it's a very rapid acceleration of the demand for UCPE. And that is what's driving the service providers. So if that's the demand side, what about the cost side? That's the other big change. There's been a significant decline in the price of the hardware platforms, and even more so in the price of the VNFs. And the latter is really driven more by pricing policy. Many of the players who were initially getting into VNFs are former full-stack providers, and some of them were pricing very defensively to keep their revenue margin unchanged, even though they weren't shipping all that tin anymore. Eventually, enough carriers beat them up, and they gradually got into something that's a reasonable business model. So what we see is we're well below the magic number. The most common number I'd hear is, I'd say, sort of 1.6 to 1.8 is where the cost parity is in terms of the number of VNFs you have to be deploying on average to be breaking even. Why is 2 the magic number? Well, my argument would be, if it's just one VNF, you have a viable means of deploying it bare metal. It's really when you are talking about deploying 2 or more that you must have this middleware layer in order to multiplex the hardware up into a variety of VNFs. So that threshold has been crossed. It has been crossed globally, and if you don't see the math and you're a service provider, then go talk to your purchasing people, because they are not pushing hard enough on their vendors. It is possible. So that's what I see on the selection side. Typical deployments, it's very simple. SD-WAN, firewall, and something. We call it SD-WAN, firewall, and the very long tail. There is no doubt that SD-WAN deployments are the catalyst for most UCPE deployments. And where you have SD-WAN deployed, you're typically going to want to deploy a firewall as well. Some of the SD-WAN vendors are saying, well, use my firewall functionality, it's good enough, which works at the lower end of the market. But as you get up into sophisticated enterprise accounts, they'll say, no, thank you. I'm a Palo Alto shop or a Fortinet shop or Checkpoint or whatever, and you must be able to run that as a VNF. End of story. Next most common after that pairing, I would say WAN acceleration is the most common. We see that in about 40% or so of the deals. Within those, it's probably only in about 10% of the sites, though. Many of the sites are smaller, they don't benefit from it. So that's sort of the nature of it. The most interesting thing that we see now, and it's getting to be a bit of a must-have on the demand side, or at least on the winning a contract side for the service provider, is a customer tenancy. So the end enterprise will say, gee, that's great. I'm happy to rent a SD-WAN firewall service from you, but you are going to be deploying shiny new computers out at all of my 2,000 sites. I love it. It lets me turn off that old Windows NT server that I have out there. I want to grab 2-core, 4-core, 8-core from you, run it for me as a Pico cloud, please, and I will put my applications on top. That is very common now. As sort of, it's just making that crossing from the service providers must be able to say they can do it to win the deal, and now they have to be able to show it. So that's sort of where that part is in the market. What else is happening in the service provider space? This one's interesting. So pretty much all the service providers are behaving the same way, right? They've got a pyramid of their customers. They got the fewer big ones at the top, and then they have their mass market. Almost all of them start at the top, right? That's what justifies the cost of making this transition. And so they go serve the top of their pyramid with UCP solutions. Once they get that established, once they get rolling, they start saying, now can I go down market? And so I'd said earlier, when you are looking at UCPE, it's really kind of 2 VNFs and up is where you would think it makes sense. Why are service providers taking it into this single VNF space? And there are 3 reasons. Number one is financial. Right? So when you actually run the full costs on having a plethora of different CPE types. So if I've got a major service provider, I might have 200 different types of CPE that I deploy for different services. Some legacy ones I wish I could kill, some newer ones that are going at good volume for me, et cetera. If I can start to reduce that, not to 1, of course, but from 200 down to 100 or something like that, I am making a significant impact on the warehousing costs, my logistics problems, on inventory turns, all the sorts of numbers that CFOs care a lot about. That is driving behavior in the service providers. And they're willing to pay a little more, not a lot, but a little more for an x86-based solution in order to realize that financial benefit. Second, what's true for the hardware is true for the wetware. So the humans sitting in the back office, if they have one way to manage CPE deployments, it is obviously simpler for them. Training is simpler, tool development is simpler, et cetera. So that same logic applies back in the back office. And then finally, the NFVI functionality itself, you typically will embed switching, carrier Ethernet functionality, some routing, and in many cases, that is sufficient for some of the simpler, lower-end deployments. And so we see accounts that are looking at using our platform to simply introduce, gather that first win, and then serve as the upgrade platform upon which to sell new and more interesting services. The other side is cost, so we talked about that a bit. In the past year, DRAM prices have dropped precipitously. That has helped a ton in terms of making new CPE solutions play in. And the other thing is volume, right? So as we all know, as consumers of consumer electronics, the higher the volume, the cheaper the price. These miracles can roll off the factory lines at tremendously low prices as long as the volume is high. And we are now getting to the point where service providers are starting to buy in pallets instead of buying in units, and that allows the manufacturers to start to drive their prices down and pass them through. So that's the second big trend that I would talk about, is that in the service provider market is this interest in going down market. All right, so let's leave the service providers alone and let's talk about enterprises. So they are growing. So as I mentioned before, they are definitely driving the service provider behavior. But interestingly, they're also trying to buy direct. So if you take a step back and think about the pre-UCPE world and all those pizza boxes coming out of all those factories all over the world, routers, firewalls, SD-WAN, what have you. Globally, about 60, 66%, say 2/3, have gone directly to enterprise. So they are owned by the end enterprise and they build their own solutions, versus about 1/3 get wrapped up somehow into a managed service offering via the telco. These numbers vary by geography and by application, but it's something like that. This is interesting because it tells us that there's actually a market that's twice as big, potentially for UCPE on that side. So we see that demand coming, and the key for getting into that part of the market is the distribution channels, right? There's plethora of different distribution channels facing them. There are different models from system integrators all the way down to straight up resellers. And getting that worked out and getting enough simplicity baked into the system so that you can actually turn up a UCP solution is where the industry is sort of finding its footing just now. So that's the next thing I'd call your attention to, is the emergence of direct enterprise demand. The last thing that I'd say is really interesting going on in the UCP space is technology. So cloud native is here, right? So we have been offering this for a little while now. We offer container functionality a couple different ways, either integrated directly into the NFVI, sort of an in-the-lab integration, or much more commonly, when the final demand is a tenant application like we were talking about earlier, or something that's just sort of to be defined later. The model is to use containers. So that's often isolated in the guest VM, often Kubernetes orchestrated, and the trick is to have the ability to service chain through the container space back down and then into the VM space successfully without dropping packets, without introducing undue management burdens. And as we were talking about earlier, in the case where that container space is a tenant application as distinct from the service provider's managed applications, then the other big trick is managing that management access segregation, making sure the service provider can see their managed applications and only theirs, and conversely, that the enterprise can only see the tenant applications. So that's sort of the frothy edge of the wave now in the UCP space. So there you go. A quick run through, maybe just to summarize then. So round one with the full stack vendors and their Frankenstein solutions and their Tetris puzzles and all that is to some extent over. And many of the service providers who went down that path initially have had their tiers, and they're coming around now to the fully disaggregated solution. Round 2 is well underway. Disaggregation is the point. Being able to swap out my hardware vendors independently from my application vendors is critical. It's what enables the operators to react to the market. And service provider adoption has hit an inflection point in the last year. That is really the bit that we've seen, and it'll continue. I know that simply by virtue of the number of deals that are in the final stages. POCs, they've done their RFI, now they're at the RFP stage, et cetera. They have a predictable behavior. These decisions will get made. We'll win some, maybe we'll lose some, but the decisions are going to get made. Service providers are deciding now. And as I said before, cloud native is now the interesting technology frontier. The VNFs themselves aren't going to be coming very often as containers, but the end customer applications that they want to run on top as part of the service chain most certainly will. That is set. So the market's set, the market's moving, and look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you.